me, before Jesus Christ walked on the face of the earth. Cicero was neither Jew nor Christian. See, he was just a man looking for answers, and he's drawing these conclusions by the logical deductions of things in the universe. He's not drawing those conclusions based on reading of the New Testament because it hasn't even been written yet. He's not basing those drawings based on the Word of God. He's basing them on the reality of the evidences that he's seeing in life through the governments of man and how to have a society that operates in a peaceful, harmonious action. See? So his whole purpose behind everything here that he's doing is to find the reason for law and a common ground for order of government. Because you have to remember, Cicero's a lawyer. He sat on the councils of government. This is one of the highest ranking individuals in the Roman Senate, if you will. And he's writing these things that are completely contradicting the mainstream ideology of the day. Said in that we just read, talks about God's law equaling reason or right reason, which equals wisdom. And when it's applied to government in human relations, it brings justice. And the people together in that are in the same commonwealth. That's us. That's where we are right now, see? We're operating in that same commonwealth. We're operating in that right reason. And we're operating in that place where God would have us to operate through the power and the presence of recognizing him as the supreme being. So in Matthew 22, I want to go there right quick, because the whole point of this, we relate these things back to what we have in the scriptures, is telling us. It's amazing to me to see that these similarities. Matthew 22 and 36 says, Master, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus answered him and said, Thou shalt love thy Lord thy God with all thy heart and with all thy soul and with all thy mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like unto it, that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two commandments hangs all the law of the prophets. See? So the two greatest commandments that God has set forth in motion for us is to love God, follow his law, and to love our fellow man, which is exactly the things that he's been talking about, is what it takes to keep an order and synchronized society. See? Cicero taught that all of mankind can learn virtue through God's law. He didn't care if they were black, if they were Jew, if they were white, if they were whatever. He said we were all of the same blood, and that all mankind can learn virtue. He also taught that legislation is a violation of God's natural law. It's a scourge, he said, to humanity, that all law must be measured from God's law. So Cicero believed that if we did not measure all of God's law, or all of man's law, to God's law, that we were doing an injustice to society, and that a Senate was actually a scourge upon humanity, because they couldn't be trusted to maintain God's law, because there again, we're going back to being self-governed, see? Cicero's idea was all the people would live in harmony, knowing what was right within their own self and doing it without having somebody over them to tell them what to do. That the concept, or the vision, if you will, that he had was a free people living under their own guidelines, doing what was right by their fellow man, because he believed that through right reason that we would all draw the same conclusions eventually by the laws of God if we just submitted to the laws of nature. As we walk by the law or natural law, which were the laws of God, which we can go back and we have the Ten Commandments. We have all kinds of scriptures that they didn't have at that time that we can say, this is God's law, and come off of. But his point is, even without that, There is an inherent knowing within man that he knows that he shouldn't murder one another. And so if we do those things and we walk in those things, then we would be a whole people in a harmony working together. And some of the concepts that the forefathers got from Cicero that they protected in our liberty documents, I'll call them, was the unalienable rights, what they called them, which he went on in that Declaration of Independence. And some of those unalienable rights are listed down through. There's several that weren't listed, but there's a whole list of rights that they declared to be unalienable. We'll go into them at another time. And then there were unalienable duties. Well, you don't hear much about the duties of man left in our society anymore. But there's a whole list of duties that they declared were unalienable. In other words, they weren't given by man. They weren't given by jurisdiction or law. They were given by God's supreme rule, because God's supreme rule, you see, it's not limited by space. It's not limited by time. It's not limited by government offices or man's ideology. It is all transcendent, and it is all powerful, and it is equally broad across the nation for all man. Not only the nation, but all of creation, all the universe, actually. See, Cicero, he's expanded this not only to the earth, but to all of the entire universe was under that order or that law of God. And therefore, the whole universe we shared as a commonwealth in our walking and moving. Some of the other principles were habeas corpus. They believed in limited government. They believed in separation of powers, to checks and balances, the self-preservation. They believed in the right to contract, the justice by reparation or paying for damages. They believed that the bearing of arms was a God-given right. They believed that taxation without representation was protected by the precepts of God's law, and they believed that family and marriage was sanctified by the laws of God, and they were protected and sanctified by the laws of God. So therefore, there is no law that can be written by man to violate what God has set to be in order on those subjects. And that's just 12 of them. That, there's more than that that they drew out of some of Cicero's writings, because he honestly stood for that independent individual living a life of self-government and self-responsibility to walk forward in life as a society, if you will. So the self-governing aspect that we have to resonate in our society is exactly what Cicero said was the key element, the most important thing for the success of an individual or independently governed society to be able to operate. And so number one principle, number one thing, and it's still today, the very most number one thing that we have to have for a republic or a government of any form to be truly successful, for the people to truly be able to be free and independent and operate in the will of what God has intended for us, is we must be able to rightly divide God's law and walk in that justice and law and be self-determined to regulate or control ourselves, to submit to those laws willfully without anybody over us making it happen. And then when we don't, then guess what? It's required that we have a master. I believe it was Benjamin Franklin that said that just paraphrase, I don't have the quote on top of my head, but we'll get to it. I'll look it up and we'll come to it another time probably, but it said something to the effect of the more lewd and out of control a society becomes, the more need of masters they have. So when we violate that common sense law of doing right by our fellow man out of love, see, that's what Cicero talked about, that love, those two commandments. It is in the Word of God. The greatest of all is that love, that desire of wanting the good for another over your own selfish ambitions. That is love. And when we operate in that, that's the glue that holds it together. That's the catalyst that keeps it moving, because if we're all doing that, then we all win, we all gain. Nobody's out to get anybody, and the society operates on that preset smoothly. It's when we become self-centered and selfish individuals that we lose sight of the larger picture. So that's covering that principle number one. We'll get into virtue and the virtuous people maybe a little bit. Well, not maybe, but we will. The next time, the second principle that they believed was absolutely vital to the success of a free and independent nation was to have virtuous and moral people. And I venture to say that the definitions that they had of those titles were probably different than what you're thinking in your mind. But we'll go over that next time. So until then, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you on the pod.